Thank you very much for inviting me, for having me. What I'd like to do is to speak to you about some things that I know you understand already, but which I think maybe deserve to be put into words. I want to speak to you for a moment about how I think we ought to characterize what Ukrainians are going through now in Ukraine. I believe the best way to characterize it, or the most economical and precise way to characterize it, is as a genocide. I then want to say a word about what Ukrainians are defending, a word about why it matters, not just in Ukraine, although that's very important as well, but how it matters to the world, how it matters to the world of ideas and ethics, how it matters to the world of politics that Ukraine is resisting. And then finally, a word about an institution which matters a great deal to me, as was said, which is the Ukrainian Catholic University, UCU. So the word genocide is used a great deal, but it does have a very precise meaning. The meaning is laid out in the 1948 Convention. I usually don't use the word genocide in my academic work because people have different notions of what it means. But when we're discussing a war that's ongoing and practices that are ongoing, I think it's important to take this very precise legal term and apply it. Some people say we oughtn't to talk about genocide because we'll never be able to prosecute. I don't understand that. I believe that the legal term is also a human challenge. The legal term is also full of ethical content. And if a crime has been committed, especially this most horrible of crimes, we ought to be aware of it. We ought to take it in while it's happening. Not least because if we don't take it in while it's happening, we'll never be able to remember it later on. It's very important to register events as they are taking place because you can't remember the thing which you never noticed the first time around. So it won't be any surprise to any of you here when I say that the acts that the forces of Russia have committed on the territory of Ukraine are genocidal. There's no real controversy, I think, in saying that the war itself involved the deliberate destruction of members of a group. I think there's no real controversy in pointing out that the destruction of the city of Mariupol, and it looks like the death of something like 100,000 citizens of that city, is part of an effort to deliberately destroy a group. All of you will know about the deportation of some 4 million Ukrainian citizens to the Russian Federation. That's 1/10 of the population of the country, and these are Russia's own figures. To imagine the scale of that, you have to imagine the depopulation of all of New England, plus the deportation of New York, plus the deportation of Pennsylvania, every last man, woman, and child. Imagine all of that completely empty of human beings. Imagine that happened to the United States, and then you have the scale of the event which has taken place in Ukraine. If we add to that, that in these deportations, the Russians are deliberately taking children and deliberately taking women who they believe can be assimilated, then you're touching on another aspect of the Genocide Convention of 1948, which is the attempt to prevent births in the future. You're touching on yet another aspect of the convention, which is the forcible deportation of children, which is the 5th point on the list of genocidal crimes. So I'm not surprising any of you when I recite these things that you all know about. You all know that everywhere territory is deoccupied, we find not only death pits, but torture chambers. And that, by the way, is genocide too. You all know about all of this. And you won't be surprised as well to hear me say that this is all intentional. So one thing that people say about genocide, and this troubles me very much morally, I have to say, is that you can never really prove the intention. The problem with that is that if you can never really prove the intention, then the 1948 Convention on Genocide is meaningless. Inside the 1948 Convention on Genocide, there is, of course, the idea of intention, just as there is, for example, in the crime of murder. People will say, Well, you can never look into someone's mind and be sure exactly what their intentions were. But that's true of any crime. That's always true. But legal specialists and psychologists and historians and others have ways of building up contexts around actions to show that there was an intention. As a historian, I can say, this is indeed sometimes difficult, but not in this case. What's surprising about this case, or what's historically new about this case, is that the perpetrators of genocide continually tell us what they are doing and what they intend. This is not like a 20th century example of genocide where we have to try to track down that missing document which actually expresses an intention. All you have to do is listen to the speeches of the President of the Russian Federation. All you have to do is read RIA Novosti or other official press outlets of the Russian Federation. All you have to know is that Russian television is owned by the state, and according to the President of the Russian Federation, expresses the views of the Russian state. And those of you who watch Russian television, which I realize is something difficult, but those of you who watch Russian television will know that night after night, genocidal intention is expressed, and not at all indirectly. Genocidal intention is expressed directly and regularly. Indeed, if anything, what worries me is that what's happening is that so much genocidal intention has been expressed that we get used to it, that we get jaded, that we hear so much of it that we think, well, I don't want to believe this is really genocide, and I'm really a bystander. Therefore, I want more proof that this is genocide. And so then the standard of what's genocidal intent and what's genocide goes up and up and up. But I just wanted to say very calmly, it's quite clear that acts of genocide have been committed, and it's quite clear that the intention is present. There's so much else that could be said about Ukrainian resistance, but I think this word genocide helps us to describe what Ukrainian resistance is against. If I could modestly say a word about what I understand Ukrainian resistance to be for, I will say it on the basis of my conversations with the widows and with the soldiers and with the volunteers, the people who are driving vans with supplies, on the basis of my friends. It's striking to me that when people talk about freedom, which is the word that I hear most of the time, it's not just freedom from. It's not just we need to be out from under the Russians. It's not just that we need this war to be over. It's not just that we need this genocide to stop. When people speak about freedom in Ukraine, and I mean this literally from the president on down to people who are kind enough to talk to me from their bombed out houses, it's very striking that they talk about freedom as being in the future. The freedom to continue things that were going well, the freedom to take a country which was doing better and make it do still better, the freedom to have variety in life, the freedom to imagine that your children will have more interesting lives than you did. That sort of thing, not just getting the bad things out, however horrible they might be, but having freedom in the sense of being able to continue to make things better. This is very striking to me in what people said. It's also very striking in what people do. So I spoke of civil society before, which can sound like a kind of abstraction. What's civil society? We're civil society. UCU is civil society. Groups of people who get together horizontally to do things together and to support one another are civil society. And of course, one of the reasons why the Ukrainian army is doing so well is civil society. The habit of cooperating where the government is not, filling in all the niches, filling in all the gaps, doing the things that the government can't or won't do. All of those young men and women driving vans, all of those young men and women collecting funds, collecting things. That is part of the secret of why Ukraine is doing so well. But it's also an idea of freedom. That freedom isn't just about me being by myself, not being bothered by somebody else. Freedom is also my ability to cooperate with other people to get things done that I couldn't do on my own, all by myself. So civil society in that sense represents freedom. And of course, there's also the idea, which I find very important and very resonant here, the idea of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech. So in this country, we often think freedom of speech means going to somebody else's university campus and saying the most obnoxious thing you can think of and waiting for a reaction. And I think that's a sign of our frivolity and our decadence. That my right to go to another university campus and say something appalling may be legally protected somewhere in the penumbrum of freedom of speech. But that's not what freedom of speech is actually about. Freedom of speech is actually about taking risks. That's what it's there for. The longest and strongest tradition about the freedom of speech, which goes all the way back to Euripides and passes through such thinkers like Havel, who I talked to Zelensky about, says that freedom of speech is about speaking truth to power. That's why we have freedom of speech, to speak truth to power. It might mean that other things are protected, but what freedom of speech is essentially about is speaking truth to power. So when I think of, for example, President Zelensky saying just as the war began, coming out in front of one of his offices with his crew, and saying "President tut," right? The president is here. That's freedom of speech in this sense. It's true, but it's also taking a risk. It's taking a bodily risk. It's true, and the assassins were in Kiev. It's true, and the bombs were falling. And that is a reminder to us also about what freedom is about. So this begins the part of the talk where I say what I think Americans actually owe to Ukrainians, because I think we owe to Ukrainians this reminder that not only freedom of speech, but freedom more broadly, and indeed democracy itself, depends upon a certain kind of ethic of taking risks. We had got, or many of us had got ourselves persuaded, indeed mesmerized, by the idea that we are free because of who we are, which is not true. That we are free because of something that some larger structure does for us. There's capitalism, therefore there will be democracy. Not true. We're free because of some kind of historical trajectory which we will just ride on, some arc of history. Not true. You're always working against the arc of history. You're always working against the larger structures. As Frederick Douglass said about freedom, it's always a struggle. If it's not a struggle, then it's not about freedom. We've had 30 years of far too many Americans and far too many people in the West in general thinking that democracy and freedom are something which will just be brought along for us and that we will just ride along on. And what did that mean? It meant that in February of 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, too many of us in Europe, in the United States, thought the same thing that people in Moscow thought. We all thought, the Ukrainians will run. The Ukrainians won't fight. How can they possibly resist? How can they possibly stay? Because if all you think matters are the larger factors, then when the larger factors turn against you, what are you going to do? Of course you're going to run. But it's not about the larger factors. It's not about the larger factors. Freedom and democracy can't be about the larger factors. They have to be about people who are making difficult choices on the basis of some ethic. And that ethic is that the people should rule. We say the word democracy over and over again so that it loses any semblance of a meaning. But that's what democracy means. It means the people should rule. They don't by themselves. No larger force brings it about. And this is what the Ukrainians have reminded us of. And this is my American we, right? This is something that we needed to be reminded of and need to be reminded of and will need to be reminded of. But there's also a very specific thing. That was specific enough, I hope, but there's also a much more hard-headed thing that Americans have to thank Ukrainians for. And I'm now going to say something which, in my opinion, and there are people here who are in this establishment and then can correct me, but I think that this is something which is so powerfully true that it's impossible to say inside the American national security establishment. And that thing is that Ukrainian resistance to Russia has done more to advance basic consensus bipartisan American national security interests than any American policy since the end of the Cold War. And indeed, that it has done more for basic American consensus bipartisan national security interests than any American policy could do. That the Ukrainians are doing things that the Americans simply could not do without them. This is not how, to put it very gently, Americans are used to seeing and talking about the world, right? This is not how we usually portray how things happen in the world. I think it is authentically difficult for us to see how much another faraway country is doing for us. And I think once we see it, it becomes politically difficult to say it. But since I'm not in politics, I can say it, and I'm going to say it. I assume you're all applauding about my promise not to go into politics. That's very sweet. So let me try to be precise about this. And I say this as somebody who works on the history of strategy and works a bit on the history of war and international relations. What people agree about is that the great danger in the 21st century is the American confrontation with China. That's not something the Republicans or the Democrats say. It's something that they all say. And what is the place where that conflict will come to be? What is the military flashpoint? Again, everyone agrees, not Democrats, not Republicans, everyone agrees the flashpoint is Taiwan. And what has just happened to make that flashpoint suddenly seem much, much less dangerous than it was before? Ukrainian resistance to Russia. Everybody always fights the last war, and that includes the Chinese. Right now, Beijing is much, much more hesitant to consider an adventure in the Pacific over Taiwan for one reason and one reason alone, and that is that the Ukrainians have resisted and shown how difficult such a war of aggression would be. With this alone, by making this scenario much less likely, the Ukrainians have made an American-China confrontation and a really major war much less likely. They have also, by the same token, made a real nuclear war much, much less likely in our lifetimes, in the lifetimes of our children. I do not think Ukrainians are getting enough credit for this, and it seems to me that it's very important. And incidentally, it's not something the Americans could have done by themselves. Likewise with Russia. Everyone who works on China in the administration will tell you China is so much more important than Russia. You guys are distracted by Russia right now, but let me tell you, China is the real thing. But how do you get to China? What the Ukrainians have been able to do is not only make the scenario for war less likely, but they've also made it much harder for China to use Russia to provoke the West, which is what Russia is there for. Russia is there to do the things for China that China wants to say it wouldn't ever do. Now Russia has been exposed as weak, and Russia has been exposed for what it is, I think, for many people anyway, legally and morally, which means that its value against Europe and the West generally as a Chinese cat's paw has fallen catastrophically. There is nothing, again, the United States could have done on its own to weaken the Russian armed forces and to weaken Russia's international reputation the way that Ukrainians have done. That was beyond our reach in every respect. We could not have done that without the Ukrainians. So as a result of these two things, the relaxation of the Taiwan scenario and the weakening of the Russian Federation, Ukrainians have done more, I'm going to repeat, for American national security interests than any American policy has done since the end of the Cold War, and more than any policy could do. So now you'll understand that I don't represent the American national security establishment. Because the simple human truth of all of this is that that's a little embarrassing, right? But the more profound truth, and the one that I want to land on as a human being, but also as an American, is that this means that Americans owe Ukraine. They owe Ukraine because of the defense of democracy as an ethic and freedom as an ethic for which you take risks. But even if you somehow don't care about that, and all you care about is the hard geopolitical realist stuff, then what Ukraine has done for the United States is make the risk of confrontation with China much, much lower in ways that we could not have done for ourselves. So, for that, in my American we, I say thank you. I say thank you to Ukrainians. But there's a specific way before I leave this lectern that I want to say thank you, and that is thank you to UCU, which is why we're here. So in the themes of my little speech today, you can see many connections. I hope you'll have seen many connections to UCU. On the week that the war started, on the Monday of the week that the war started, I was trying to take part in a remote doctoral dissertation defense for a young historian at UCU, who was writing a pioneering dissertation about the Rudnitsky family, a very important Ukrainian family. And then the next day, or later that week, he signed up for the territorial defense, which is, in a nutshell, the situation in which many wonderful and ethically devoted and intelligent young Ukrainians find themselves. In my little speech here, the themes that have to do with UCU, I hope, were evident. Number one is the very idea of the people. So inside genocide is about the destruction of a people. And so what is the opposite of genocide? The opposite of genocide isn't just the protection and defense, but it's, I think, more profoundly the creation of a people, an idea of what the people are supposed to be in the future. And looking at it from the outside, from my own humble and limited perspective, it seems to me that that was one of the reasons why UCU was refounded, on a notion of what the people, the Ukrainian people, might aspire to be in the future. So the opposite of destroying a people is trying to create a people. In addition to that, there's the idea of the person, right, of personhood, which I think is essential to UCU, to the kind of Catholic ethical teachings that are associated with UCU, and the notion that a person has inherent dignity, that a person is not just part of the larger forces, that we are not just in this physical universe and that the things that happen to us are a result of larger forces, but in fact there's a certain kind of dignity within us, which means that at least here and there we can assert freedom and take responsibility. That can be understood as an idea of personhood. And then finally, there is civil society, right? The Ukraine that we can see today, the Ukraine which is resisting this horrible genocidal invasion, is a Ukraine of civil society. And for me, one of the most beautiful examples of civil society in Ukraine is the one that we are all here to support, the Ukrainian Catholic University. And I'm very glad that I was invited to be here with you to help you support it. Thank you very much.